When Ethan Mercer bought his lakefront property, he thought he was paying for peace, privacy, and the beautiful shoreline that came with it. The small community surrounding the lake looked perfect from the outside: quiet mornings, fishing boats drifting across the water, and neighbors who waved as they passed. But everything changed when a self-appointed HOA enforcer named Karen Whitmore decided she controlled far more than the neighborhood rules. What started as a few passive-aggressive complaints quickly turned into something much bigger when Karen began treating Ethan's section of shoreline like her personal property. Before long, fences appeared, warning signs went up, and residents were being told that Ethan no longer had access to land he legally owned. Bro, hearing this just blew my mind because Karen wasn't just crossing a line, she was rewriting reality. What she didn't realize was that her power trip would eventually attract the attention of county officials, property surveyors, and records that couldn't be argued with. And when the truth finally surfaced, the fallout was unbelievable. Ethan Mercer had spent nearly 15 years working long shifts as a commercial electrician before finally reaching a point where he could afford the kind of property he had dreamed about since he was a teenager. He wasn't looking for a mansion or some luxury estate. He just wanted a quiet lakefront home where he could spend weekends fishing, relaxing, and staying away from the constant noise of city life. When he found a modest house sitting along the northern edge of Clearwater Lake, it felt like everything had fallen into place. The property came with a stretch of shoreline that extended beyond most neighboring lots, and according to every survey and county record he reviewed before closing, ownership of that shoreline was crystal clear. For the first few months, life was exactly what Ethan had imagined. The neighborhood was calm. Most residents kept to themselves. The lake was beautiful year-round, and Ethan quickly settled into a routine of early morning fishing and evening walks along the water. Looking back, those first months almost felt too peaceful. Because the moment Karen Whitmore entered the picture, everything began changing. Karen lived 3 houses away from Ethan. Technically, she wasn't even an elected HOA president. In fact, the community's homeowners association barely functioned. Meetings were rare, attendance was low, and most residents ignored it completely. Somehow, Karen had appointed herself as the neighborhood's unofficial authority figure. She inserted herself into everything. Lawn height. Parking habits. Exterior paint colors. Holiday decorations. If there was an opportunity to tell someone what they should or shouldn't be doing, Karen would find it. At first, Ethan only heard stories. Neighbors would casually mention disputes Karen had started over minor issues. One family received multiple complaints because their mailbox wasn't the exact shade approved by outdated HOA guidelines. Another resident was threatened with fines because guests parked on the street during a birthday party. Ethan figured every neighborhood had someone like that. As long as she stayed out of his business, he didn't care. That assumption lasted exactly 6 months. One Saturday morning, Ethan woke up and noticed 2 bright yellow signs planted near the shoreline. The signs read, "Private HOA Waterfront Access, Residents Only." The problem was obvious immediately. The signs weren't on HOA property. They were sitting directly on Ethan's land. At first he thought it had to be some kind of mistake. He removed the signs carefully and placed them beside the road. He didn't damage them. He didn't complain. He simply assumed someone had installed them in the wrong location. 3 days later they reappeared. Same signs. Same location. This time Ethan called the HOA management company. The representative sounded confused. They claimed they hadn't authorized any new signs and promised to look into it. Ethan figured that would be the end of it. It wasn't. Within 2 weeks, more changes started appearing near the shoreline. Wooden posts appeared along parts of the property line. Small markers showed up directing residents toward what Karen was now referring to as the community waterfront area. Except the path she was promoting led directly across Ethan's property. Bro, this is the part where things started feeling unreal. Karen wasn't acting like someone making an honest mistake. She was acting like someone who genuinely believed she could redefine ownership simply by repeating something often enough. And surprisingly, some residents started believing her. Ethan first learned this when he arrived home from work and found strangers sitting in folding chairs on his shoreline. Families were fishing from the edge of his property. Kids were running through areas that were clearly marked as private land. When Ethan politely explained that the area wasn't public, several people looked genuinely confused. They told him Karen had informed everyone that the shoreline belonged to the HOA. That statement immediately raised red flags. The HOA didn't own waterfront property in that section of the neighborhood. County maps showed that clearly. Property surveys showed that clearly. The original subdivision plans showed that clearly. Yet somehow Karen had convinced enough people that the lie was spreading faster than the truth. Ethan attempted to handle the situation professionally. He printed copies of property maps. He installed legal boundary markers. He even paid for an updated survey to eliminate any possibility of confusion. The surveyors confirmed exactly what every previous record had shown. The shoreline belonged to Ethan. For case closed. At least that's what a reasonable person would think. Karen wasn't reasonable. Instead of backing down, she doubled down. She began telling residents that Ethan's survey was inaccurate. Then she claimed county records hadn't been updated. Then she suggested the shoreline had been designated for community use decades ago. Every time one explanation fell apart, she simply invented another. What shocked Ethan most wasn't Karen's behavior. It was how confidently she delivered every claim. That's exactly how people act in real life when they've convinced themselves they're untouchable. Facts stop mattering. Documentation stops mattering. Reality itself becomes optional. As summer approached, traffic across Ethan's property increased dramatically. More residents started using the shoreline. Boats appeared near his dock. Visitors wandered through his yard. Every weekend seemed to bring new headaches. Then one evening Ethan came home and saw something that made his stomach drop. Workers were unloading fencing materials near the shoreline. And standing beside them was Karen. Pointing directly toward Ethan's property. At that moment, Ethan realized this wasn't going to be a simple neighbor dispute anymore. This was becoming something much bigger. The moment Ethan saw stacks of fencing materials being unloaded near his shoreline, he knew the situation had crossed into dangerous territory. Up until then, Karen's actions had been irritating, dishonest, and unbelievably entitled, but they still lived mostly in the world of rumors and misinformation. A fence was different. A fence meant someone was preparing to physically alter property boundaries. And if Karen succeeded, her lie could start looking like reality to everyone else. Ethan immediately contacted the contractor listed on the truck. After a brief conversation, the workers revealed something shocking. Karen had hired them under the claim that the HOA owned the waterfront section and had authorized a shoreline improvement project. The contractor had never verified ownership because he assumed HOA paperwork had already been handled. Once Ethan presented copies of his survey and deed, the crew became visibly uncomfortable and suspended work until ownership could be confirmed. Most people would have backed off right there. Karen did the exact opposite. Within days, she began telling neighbors that Ethan had intimidated the contractors and delayed a project that was supposedly intended to benefit the entire community. The story spread quickly. Suddenly, residents who barely knew the facts were treating Ethan like the problem. Some avoided him entirely. Others gave him cold looks whenever he drove through the neighborhood. Bro, this part genuinely frustrated me. Karen wasn't just trying to take property anymore. She was actively turning public opinion against the person who actually owned it. Then things became even worse. One morning Ethan discovered fresh notices attached to several community bulletin boards. The notices announced future HOA plans for expanded waterfront access, additional seating areas, and a shared recreational zone. Every single proposed improvement sat directly on Ethan's land. The craziest part? The documents looked official. Logos. Letterheads. Signatures. Everything appeared legitimate at first glance. That was when Ethan stopped viewing this as a neighborhood dispute and started viewing it as something else entirely. Because if Karen was willing to create paperwork that looked official, there was no telling how far she was prepared to go. And soon, Ethan would discover that she had already gone much further than anyone imagined. Ethan spent the next several days gathering every document he could find. Property surveys, deed records, subdivision maps, county planning documents, historical shoreline filings. He built a file so thick it looked like preparation for a courtroom battle. The deeper he dug, the more disturbing Karen's actions appeared. Several of the notices she had posted referenced approvals that simply did not exist. Some even carried formatting that closely resembled official county communications. That discovery changed everything. Instead of arguing with Karen again, Ethan went directly to the county planning office and requested a formal review. He submitted his documentation, photographs of the signs, records of the attempted fencing project, and copies of the notices being distributed throughout the neighborhood. What happened next was something Karen never saw coming. County officials opened an investigation into the unauthorized shoreline claims. Surveyors were dispatched to verify property boundaries. Planning staff reviewed the documents Karen had circulated. Within weeks, official notices began appearing throughout the neighborhood clarifying that the shoreline belonged exclusively to Ethan's parcel and had never been designated for HOA use. Bro, I genuinely couldn't believe how fast Karen's confidence disappeared once actual authorities got involved. For months she had acted untouchable because most residents didn't know the facts. But facts have a way of catching up. Then came the moment that completely flipped the story. The county determined that several representations made about the shoreline were materially false and required immediate correction. The HOA management company, suddenly realizing the potential liability, publicly distanced itself from Karen's claims. Residents who had believed her narrative started learning the truth. Some were shocked. Others were furious. And then the ultimate blow landed. The county ordered the removal of every unauthorized sign, marker, and improvement associated with the false waterfront claims. Not only did Karen lose control of the narrative, but the entire neighborhood watched as the very project she had tried to force onto Ethan's property was dismantled piece by piece. The shoreline never changed ownership. But Karen's reputation certainly did. After the county's ruling, life around Clearwater Lake slowly returned to normal. The unauthorized signs disappeared, the proposed fencing project was permanently abandoned, and residents finally understood where the actual property lines stood. Ethan reinforced his shoreline markers and installed a few additional legal notices, but surprisingly, he rarely needed them. Once the facts became public, most neighbors respected his property without issue. Karen largely disappeared from community affairs. The same people who once accepted her claims now questioned everything she said. Watching that shift was remarkable. In the end, Ethan didn't win through arguments or drama. He won because documented truth proved stronger than entitlement. Bro, stories like this always remind me that confidence and authority are not the same thing. Karen spent months acting like she owned something she never legally controlled, but reality eventually caught up. That's exactly why records, facts, and patience matter. Entitlement can be loud, but truth usually gets the final word. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, subscribe, and stick around for more unbelievable HOA, revenge, karma, and entitled neighbor stories.